Welcome to Coffee&Regs, a CSS RegTech podcast series on moving from a tactical to strategic approach to regulatory compliance.
Hi, this is Natalie Silverman for CSS. Welcome to our next episode of Coffee&Regs. On today's episode, we're kicking off Cybersecurity Awareness Month, discussing the importance of vendor due diligence to reduce cyber incidents. Please welcome our cybersecurity experts, Yerzak and Mike Farrell. Good morning, EJ and Mike, and thanks for sitting down for Coffee&Regs.
Thank you, Natalie. Joined here by my colleague, Mike Farrell. And Mike, I want to talk for a moment here about the importance of vendor oversight, vendor due diligence. Now, we've seen in the news recently a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of breaches impacting organizations, including Kaseya, including SolarWinds. A significant increase in ransomware attacks against not only financial services firms, but for those who are private equity firms, for example, ransomware attacks against the organizations that they may invest in or own or control. So we're seeing that the threats that are out there on the cybersecurity landscape are impacting a wide variety of organizations, small and large. But one thing I think remains constant, it's the fact that a cybersecurity incident that could impact a single firm or a single vendor could have ramifications upstream and downstream. What are your thoughts on the potential implications of vendor due diligence when it comes to trying to uncover what some of these risks may be? And can we do anything about identifying these risks before it becomes too late?
That's a good point. And, like you said, more recent attacks that we've seen have been vendors that are maybe not even working with companies directly. They're vendors that are being used by other vendors, such as IT companies. And, this trend has been kind of increasing, kind of starting back with the Target data breach a handful of years ago, where it was, not Target directly, but a vendor that they worked with. And that's the problem with a lot of these companies being interconnected. You might be doing due diligence on your IT vendor and assuming that because they're your IT vendor, that they're on top of things and doing things like making sure their networks and their computers are patched, which is what they're doing for you. But at the end of the day, a lot of IT vendors are using companies like Kaseya or like SolarWinds, and those companies being, fourth or maybe even fifth parties downstream. You might not look at the direct impact that an event happening at one of these companies could have on your company. But at the end of the day, this company is using IT vendor A, and IT vendor A is using this platform to manage your computers and your antivirus and your patching. And over a weekend or a long weekend when people are maybe not necessarily in the office or taking off for the weekend, when there's not as many eyes on things, the hackers are taking that as an opportunity to exploit something that may have actually been in place quite a bit longer than what people are thinking.
Right. It sounds like the average employee on a day-to-day basis may not even be aware that their own organization has some exposure to a vendor such as Kaseya or SolarWinds or vendors like that maybe running software on their machines, maybe operating in the background, maybe used by, as you mentioned, Mike, their own MSP in terms of managing their security posture, managing their security profiles on their endpoints, on their workstations. And so when we hear about cyber threats and cyber incidents involving these vendors, which, as you mentioned, a lot of MSPs are in fact using. I mean, there are only a few major players out there in some of these spaces, and it can be surprising, I think, to some organizations to find out that they do in fact have some exposure to cyber incidents that they may have thought they were far removed from. So when it comes to evaluating an individual organization's cybersecurity risk, it seems like it's important not only to evaluate the vendors and the service providers that you're using as a company, but also perhaps, do you think it's worth questioning maybe what some of your vendors are using to provide services to you? And towards that end, where does it stop? How far down the rabbit hole do you go?
Right. And like you said, at the end of the day, it basically is a rabbit hole. But one of the things that we see that stands out when we actually do see it, because not that many companies are doing it, is periodically reviewing your vendor list, using a risk-based approach to ranking which vendors might have a larger impact on your business directly. And, asking questions like, you guys are delivering these services to us. What other platforms are you using? How is our data being protected? What data do you have of our firm that may be impacted or shared directly or indirectly with one of your vendors? And if the answer comes back that there's some pretty sensitive information that might be not even necessarily shared, but being managed through or via a fourth or fifth party, then you would want to take the next step and try to reach out and do a further deep dive. So you have this data. Okay, well, where is this data being stored? How is it being stored? Is it being encrypted? how is it being backed up? Where is it being backed up? Those are definitely the first few questions I would want to ask somebody that had my personal data or information about my clients or my employees.
And Mike, how are you seeing organizations tackle the topic of vendor due diligence? How do you ask these questions? How do you get this information?
Well, it can be tricky. Some smaller organizations tend to have one or two people or a group of people through various departments that handle due diligence requests and follow-up items like that. A lot of larger companies rely or are moving in the direction of relying on standardized security certifications like an ISO 27001, which is an international security certification. And some of these companies, they are more willing to follow up if you have specific questions, and others, like a Microsoft, for example, not to badmouth any company, but like a Microsoft is a gigantic corporation and, they have all kinds of different security certifications. You're probably less likely to get a response from somebody like a company that size than you would from maybe like your IT vendor, who for all intents and purposes should be willing to be very responsive to those kinds of requests, given the amount of access and potential impact down the road if something were to ever happen.
Okay, so this is sort of the risk-based approach that you're describing, that certain vendors, off-the-shelf software like Microsoft, they're not likely to respond to specific questions, customized questionnaires, and things of that nature. Yet we still need to be finding out some information about their security controls. But I think a lot of that information is available online, probably on their website, or something that a quick search should be able to turn up in combination with your service level agreement with that vendor. But based on the risk-based approach that you're describing, Mike, additional vendors may require a deeper dive, right? I mean, it's based on the level of access they have, based on the sensitivity of the data that you've entrusted to these vendors. One question comes to mind, as we think about some of these cybersecurity incidents that have happened recently, some of these cyber attacks. Would any more amount of vendor due diligence have stopped these breaches from occurring at a Kaseya, at a SolarWinds? Would due diligence have stopped those breaches from occurring, or are we really talking about something else here?
I mean, that's a very poignant question to ask. Would increased due diligence stop some of these attacks? Possibly, but in certain instances, the attacks were leveraging exploits or vulnerabilities that had existed or been put into place months or even a year or more before it had occurred. I think that's probably the $1 million question, will continue to be the $1 million question going forward. As a company or as an employee of a company can be as diligent and do all of your research and do, for like an IT vendor that has increased access to maybe your network and your servers and your files and all your client data, those would be considered super high risk, more than probably, twice a year performing due diligence on them just to see if anything has changed. But at the end of the day, we can be as diligent as possible trying to stay on top of things. But
right. If we had a crystal ball, we could see into the future which organizations were going to get hacked, or which organizations were going to be targeted for a cyber attack. We wouldn't really need to conduct due diligence because you would know who's going to be a target, and you would make sure that you're not using those vendors, or that you've shored up your defenses, ahead of time to, mitigate any impacts from cascading down to your organization or up to your organization. That was a great response, Mike. I mean, it sounds like you need to do the due diligence. You need to at least take reasonable measures to understand the risks that your own vendors pose to your organization, but that notwithstanding, any amount of due diligence you conduct on a vendor or any particular frequency, these attacks are still going to happen. They're still going to occur. And at that point, if and when they do occur, and increasingly it is a question of when, not if, I think the important thing at that point is to evaluate the potential impacts or the actual impacts to one's given organization to say, okay, well, this vendor that I'm using, they had a cyber incident, like many firms do, they had a cyber incident. Was my data specifically impacted in that cyber breach? Was my data not impacted? Even if my data was not impacted, is there still anything I need to be doing? Just the fact that my data wasn't stolen or hacked, does that mean that this vendor has fixed everything that led to the breach in the first place? These are really some important questions that we need to consider asking our vendors as we put them through the paces of very robust and reasonably designed vendor due diligence program. Other than that, I mean, based on what we're observing in the wild, based on the types of cyber attacks that we're seeing, is there any one particular question or handful of questions that you think are perhaps the most important to be asking vendors for to understand their potential risks?
I would definitely start with, what data do you maintain of ours, of our employees, of our clients? What access, if any, to our network in these terms, your IT vendor, what access to our network do you have? And how are you performing due diligence on your vendors? What processes do you have in place? And have an open dialogue with your vendors and be willing to work with people, because at the end of the day, we're all working together for the same end, which is making sure we're as secure as possible and trying not to be the next headline on CNN or MSNBC.
Thanks, Mike and EJ, for the insight into how you like your regs in the morning. For CSS, this is Natalie Silverman.
This has been another episode of Coffee and Regs, a CSS RegTech podcast series. Make sure you catch every episode by subscribing to our podcast on www.cssregtech.com or through your podcast platform of choice. Thanks so much for tuning in. This podcast is brought to you by Compliance Solutions Strategies and is for general information purposes only. All rights reserved.